Vietnam was considered a colony of the French Empire. But after the defeat of the French in Europe in 1940, the Japanese came in and they occupying the whole territory of Vietnam.
My first memory is of bombing. The Japanese, when they took over Nam Dinh, we ran and hid in the shelter, and when we came out, a bullet grazed the forehead of the woman who was carrying me. The blood trickled down on me. When we got home and turned on the lights, my parents thought I had been shot because I was covered with blood.
There was a question what the international powers would do for Vietnam. President Roosevelt at that time had the idea of giving a temporary status for Vietnam.
This document from FDR to Cordell Hull in early 1944, I think, speaks to the president's low opinion of what the French had done in Indochina. I think it speaks to what I think is a powerful theme, namely his belief that America risked being on the wrong side of history if it supported a French return. Franklin Roosevelt died. The French did show a determination to come back into Indochina. Harry Truman, he just didn't feel as strongly about this, and in effect did not stand in the way of this French return, which really gains steam in 1945, precisely at the moment that Ho Chi Minh is also embarking on a path to achieve independence for his country.
When the communists took the power in 1945, they tried to destroy all the nationalists. They arrest the nationalists, they kidnap the nationalists, they kill the nationalists when they can. And that is the beginning of the war between nationalists and communists. And so we are not happy with the arrival of the communists to power, but we are in bad shape by then.
So the OSS in 1945 became very involved in working to defeat the Japanese, who had taken control of Indochina early in the war, and they worked alongside the Viet Minh, which was Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary organization. Archimedes Patty is one of the OSS agents, and like, to my knowledge, every single one of them, of the OSS people, he was impressed by Ho Chi Minh. He liked him. And he pens this cable on September 2nd, 1945, precisely the moment when Ho, in Hanoi, declares independence. Borrowing, by the way, from the American Declaration of Independence in a kind of naked play for support from Washington. Patty basically says, we should work with this guy. And in effect, Patty is saying we make a mistake if we choose instead to side with the French. Most officials said, this guy is a communist, therefore we cannot work with him. And because we also need French support in Europe, which is key to prevent communism from triumphing in France, we should also work with the French in Indochina.
Two of my brothers were actually at Ba Dinh Square when Ho Chi Minh declared independence. They were very excited because they were just carried along by the psychology of the crowd. We were finally free from French domination. My father was ambivalent. He was happy that we had independence, but he was very afraid of the Viet Minh because he knew they were communists, or they had a program to transform Vietnamese society.
What Ho Chi Minh proceeded to do is to send a series of letters to President Truman, hoping for American support, because he believed that America could be his ally. And what's powerful about this is the degree to which he held this conviction. It's not really until the late 1940s that he finally says, guess I can't count on the Americans.
My oldest sister, Thang, had no ambivalence whatsoever. She and her husband were supporters of the Viet Minh. Not only would the Viet Minh liberate Vietnam from French domination, but the Viet Minh would also transform society in a way that the poor and the oppressed people would be liberated as well. In fact, she and her husband left the French zone to go into the mountains to live under the Viet Minh. One time there were a French convoy passing through Hanoi, and my father said, well, look at them, they're so strong. How are you going to defeat them? She said, don't be fooled. They might look strong, but they don't have the support of the people. We'll win. In 1954, the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, and Vietnam was divided in two, with Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh taking over the northern part down to the 17th parallel, and the French retaining the south from the 17th parallel downward.
So I arrived on August the 8th, 1954, 2 days before my 25th birthday. The Geneva Accords had occurred, the country was being divided in two, and the South was really in chaos.
When we moved to Saigon, we had no housing, my father had no job, and we were not the only refugees for North Vietnam. There were something like 800,000 to 1 million refugees from the North who had fled communism or the Viet Minh to move south, and a lot of them, the majority of them, were Catholics.
There were lots of planes flying up empty and then bringing refugees back, so I just took one of those flights. And I noticed a group of refugees standing on one side of the apron, obviously waiting for a flight. And so I started asking, why were they fleeing? And out of the crowd, in almost a chorus, was, we're afraid that the communists will kill us.
Dwight Eisenhower and his administration make a decision, in a sense, to try to succeed where the French have failed. So they're going to create a non-communist bastion in the southern part of Vietnam in order to preserve at least part of Indochina from succumbing to communism.
I tell them, we will help you. What else could I say? That became part of my motivation for becoming so involved with the Vietnamese. And I like to explain that in a way of saying that I felt I became sort of a brother of the Vietnamese who wanted to keep what remained of their country free.
So the domino theory, which Dwight Eisenhower articulated famously at a press conference in April of 1954, is a theory that argues that if one country falls, if one domino falls to communism, then all the other countries in that area will also topple.
You have a row of dominoes set up and you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is certainly that it'll go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences.
I'll never forget my surprise in seeing in Russian archives the Chinese explaining the domino theory to the Russians as a way of arguing why Hanoi should be supported. Both sides believed in the fragility of these new states.
Ngo Dinh Diem was a Catholic from central Vietnam. He has a reputation throughout Vietnam as being a very nationalist and anti-French figure. One of the enduring myths about Ngo Dinh Diem is that he was installed in power in 1954 as Prime Minister of South Vietnam by the United States. Diem was certainly aware that the communists and his other critics referred to his government as Mỹ Diem, which in Vietnamese means America's Diem. And he really chafed against this. He took steps to try to demonstrate that he was not going to do Washington's bidding.
The National Army was in disarray. There were a couple of other religious sects who had armies who were also sort of vying for power. So almost immediately, plotting started in with the Army Chief of Staff to overthrow Diem.
Diem believed that he could defeat these rivals and consolidate his authority on his own. He provoked a showdown with some of the rival groups in the spring of 1955. He defeated them in the Battle of Saigon, and he went on to establish his authority over most of South Vietnam's territory.
And he was greeted by enormous and very happy crowds. because the word had gone out that, in effect, he was getting independence for the South as well as the North. The most optimistic moment in Vietnam was in 1956, when the Republic had been declared, when a Constitution had been adopted, when the National Assembly was elected. They had parades, people walking out in the streets. I mean, there was just an air of happiness. It sort of gave me a deep sense of satisfaction about all the work that we had been involved in with the Vietnamese to get to that point, given all the difficulties that they faced at the very beginning, right after Geneva. It was some kind of miracle that South Vietnam even survived.
Basically, the United States was feeding us and clothing us and protecting us with an army and giving us a functioning government. So the United States in a way, succeeded in nation building. Of course, this was interrupted by the insurgency of the Viet Cong. But at the beginning, it was successful.
John F. Kennedy is really interesting on the Vietnam story. He had a better understanding than probably anybody else at the top level of American decision-making about the obstacles that stood in the way of any kind of success in Vietnam. Because what he says is, in effect, any Western power that seeks to defeat this revolution by military means is destined to lose. But there's a paradox, because that same Kennedy expands American involvement substantially.
We were hoping that the United States would stay and defend Vietnam, but of course in the back of our minds there was always a fear that it might not stick around, like the French. But Kennedy certainly reassured us that that was not going to happen. And of course in Vietnam he was beginning to up the ante. He was sending more equipment, more arms, more advisors.
To children, to us, we just like, oh, you see the ghost, right? You see the alien coming from other planet. To me, I just stood there because I couldn't run. Where would you run? They're making so much noise and the wind.
The Viet Cong had taken control of substantial portions of the South Vietnamese countryside by 1961. And it was clear that Diem's government was really back on its heels.
As the children, we never used the word Viet Cong. The Viet Cong is somebody we call uncles, auntie, and we call them liberation troop. Liberation troop grow in the village with us. From Viet Minh at first, Viet Minh who fought against the French.
President Diem, he and his family ruled the country at their whims, really. They were authoritarian. They suppressed any opposition.
People like my teachers and many other leadership in the village started to be disappear. So people like my family and myself, we had to get ready for the war.
After the French Indochina War, there was a period of time in which the faction that was in control in Hanoi wanted to focus on rebuilding their country. The insurgents, the revolutionaries in the South, couldn't wait for Hanoi, for Party Center, to give them the green light to take up arms. I mean, they were being decimated as a result of Ngo Diem's policies.
My family was dissatisfied with Diem from the beginning. The dissatisfaction grew when he began to crack down on the Buddhists. A lot of people who were unhappy with Diem, the people, the students, kind of rallied behind the Buddhists for their own reason. So the Buddhists became like the spear carriers for this movement to depose Diem. So of course Diem and his family cracked down really hard, and a monk burned himself in protest. The Buddhist crisis was the beginning of the end for Diem and his family.
As the summer months go by in 1963, American officials, both in Washington and in Saigon, become increasingly distraught. They basically say to one another, we're not going to win this thing with Diem in power.
I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government to win popular support, that the war can be won out there. In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it.
The Hillsman Cable was a secret telegram that was drafted on August 24th, 1963. It was drafted mainly by the Undersecretary for East Asian Affairs, Roger Hillsman, with the help of some other State Department officials. And it was sent specifically to the newly arrived ambassador in South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge. The telegram authorized Lodge to open communications with commanders of the South Vietnamese Army, who at that time were known to be plotting a coup against Ngo Dinh Diem.
I went to see him, and he asked me, he said, "Do you think there's going to be a coup?" And I didn't feel like I could lie to him. And I didn't know the details, but I knew that it was certainly in the air. I said it was possible. On the day of the coup, he chooses to tell Lodge that I will accept President Kennedy's recommendations. Basically, he's saying he'll do whatever we want, but it came too late.
So the coup against the Diem government began in the early afternoon of November 1st, 1963. Diem made the decision to place a phone call to the U.S. Embassy to speak to the American ambassador. Lodge pretended not to know what was going on. He also suggested that perhaps the time had come for Diem to leave the country. Diem refused to do this, and he responded instead by saying that he had always done what duty and good sense require, and that he believes in duty above all else.
After the coup, I went to the palace with a friend, and we went to the sitting room where we had sat, and there was the sofa that I had sat on, and it was riddled with bullet holes.
In November of 1963 was the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem and Ngo Dinh Nhu, and then a few weeks later, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. This was when the North Vietnamese would attempt to win the war outright, topple the Saigon regime, and basically present the United States with a fait accompli so that it wouldn't deepen its involvement and transition to military intervention.
In the early part of 1964, Johnson, I think, is getting frustrated. The war is not going particularly well. Even with lots of U.S. support, the South Vietnamese military is steadily losing more ground. And I think he's decided, Johnson, from the day he comes into power after Kennedy's assassination, that he will not be the president who lost Vietnam. So when he has this conversation with Robert McNamara, who's really his most important, I think, Vietnam advisor, what's notable for me is the degree to which Johnson wants to see more.
What I want is somebody that can lay up some plans to trap these guys and whoop hell out of them, kill some of them. That's what I want to do.
I think it underscores this notion of a fundamentally hawkish Lyndon Johnson. This notion that became very popular later, which is that Americans were ignorant of Vietnam, didn't know what they were doing. They had this hubris, this exaggerated self-confidence that led them to stumble into this thing. I don't think it's true. The conversation with McGeorge Bundy in May is so interesting to me. Johnson here is in, I think it's fair to say, despair about the war.
The more I think of it, I don't know what in the hell. It looks like me we're getting into another Korea. It just worries the hell out of me. I don't see what we can ever hope to get out of there with once we're committed. I believe the Chinese communists coming into it. I don't think that we can fight them 10,000 miles away from home and ever get anywhere in that area. I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out.
What he's conscious of is that he is about to commit young men to fight in this war. And he's doing so even while he also harbors these doubts about whether it's worth it.
One thing that is Vietnam worth to me? What is Laos worth to me? What is it worth to this country?
I think that the Johnson administration entered the month of August 1964 looking for a pretext to be able to flex American muscle.
There was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin where an American ship was somehow attacked by the communists in North Vietnam.
Earlier in 1964, the United States launches covert raids against North Vietnam, involving also the South Vietnamese, to be sure, but they're really an American creation.
And I think I should also, or we should also at that time, Mr. President, explain this Op Plan 34A, these covert operations. And there's no question but what that had bearing on it. And Friday night, as you probably know, we had 4 TP boats from Vietnam, manned by Vietnamese or other nationals, attacked 2 islands.
Those raids clearly influenced the North Vietnamese to launch the initial attack against an American destroyer on the 2nd of August.
And we expended, 1,000 rounds of ammunition, one kind or another, against them. We probably shot up a radar station and a few other miscellaneous buildings. And following 24 hours after that, with this destroyer in that same area, undoubtedly led them to connect the 2 events.
And they portrayed this as being unprovoked.
Earlier tonight, the President told the nation the United States would take appropriate action to respond to the unprovoked attacks on U.S. naval vessels by torpedo boats of North Vietnam.
I think we have pretty good evidence now that there was an attack on August 2nd, but that there was not a second attack on August 4th, as the administration alleged, and it was in response to this alleged second attack on the 4th that Johnson ordered retaliatory airstrikes against selected targets within North Vietnam.
I was very, very impressed by the kind of resolute attitude from the American Congress for giving President Johnson the full power to intervene military in Vietnam.
He gets, in the aftermath of this set of strikes, a congressional resolution giving the president, as the saying goes, a kind of blank check to do what he wishes in Southeast Asia with minimal opposition. If you look at the vote, it's overwhelming in both parties. But that's a little misleading because, in fact, if you listen to the debate, if you watch what lawmakers really in both parties, especially Democrats, but what they're actually saying, it's clear that they have doubts, not so much about what happened in the Gulf. What they doubt is that Vietnam is worth the price of a large war, and I think they doubt that the South Vietnamese government will do what they have to do.